By the 1930s, basketball in Scotland had spent 4 decades struggling on the periphery, marginalised by football's dominance, lacking proper facilities and trained personnel. Yet within a decade, something shifted dramatically. The 1930s are a transformational era for basketball in Scotland, when the sport moved from niche recreational activity to a legitimate competitive sport, in large part credited to American and international students at Scottish universities as the key catalysts. This transformation of basketball nationally happened through the university system rather than the usual YMCA missionary route that spread basketball around the world. And these students didn't just play basketball, they created leagues, changed public perceptions, standardised rules, and built foundations that remain today. In this episode in this series on the history of basketball in Scotland, I am again delighted to be joined by Dr. Ross Walker, lecturer in sport management at the University of Stirling. Over the past few years, Ross has written a number of published papers about the history of the sport of basketball in Scotland. In this episode, we are going to discuss the breakthrough of basketball into the public conscience to students at universities and colleges across the country. I'd like to welcome Ross back to the podcast.
Hi, Andrew.
The key year is 1929. It was then that American and international medical students started enrolling at Scottish universities in greater numbers, fleeing Depression-era cuts, attracted by Scotland's pioneering medical programmes and distinct educational approach. This coincided with Scottish universities modernising their entire sporting infrastructure through physical welfare funds, appointing directors of physical training, and making Wednesday afternoons official sports days. How did these two developments, increased American enrolment and the reformed university sports system, intersect to create the ideal conditions for basketball to finally take root in Scotland?
Great question to start us off. I think just before I go into that, it's important to note that Americans in sport did exist in universities beforehand, in which there are accounts showing matches between the University of Edinburgh and Glasgow playing basketball post-World War One. However, these accounts are quite few and far between. However, you're absolutely correct that one of the fundamental changes was the reformed university sports system, because this gave basketball a space, location, and time to emerge, and then coupled with people who had the passion, drive, and necessary knowledge to develop the game, alter social attitudes and about the game, and then also coach others in the correct way and set rules. This was very much the perfect opportunity for basketball to establish foundations in Scotland, and it is in the university system that the key part of Scotland's basketball history really begins.
The 1930s also saw broader cultural shifts beyond the universities, the Keep Fit movement promoting basketball for health, high-profile teams like Celtic using basketball for training, the armed forces incorporating it into their training regimes. Basketball was also embedded into the state's welfareism agenda. Talk me through about how these societal transformations created the opening for basketball to be embraced and how the university students' efforts fitted within this larger cultural movement.
Collectively, what these different aspects did was they provided some form of mandate and support for basketball to be played, which had not existed before. The professional footballers who played, they made the game seem cool to all those who looked up to them. The Keep Fit movement, spearheaded by the government, put basketball to the forefront of a national movement at the time, when more and more people were getting access to leisure time and more people were encouraged to be active, because the government started to realise the health benefits from sport, and putting basketball out there really the support and push that the game needed, especially given the legitimacy from the government. Likewise, the incorporation of basketball by the armed forces was also a really big shift, because in the prior decades, it was people who worked in schools and for youth organisations who were key to developing sports, because they had the resources, equipment, and the opportunity to teach these sports. And now, so too did the army, and most importantly, en masse. Not only did they have the opportunity en masse with the ever kind of growing body of people who were being enlisted, but they were able to target the specific population who until now had almost pushed against basketball, and in the process were able to alter decades worth of stereotypes about basketball because of the amount of now men who were playing it and also were joining local teams, the ranks teams, all these, and entering competitions. And it was during this process and in the 1930s where basketball started to shift from being what we discussed on the last podcast about being a girls' game to what was deemed a man's sport. So in the last podcast, we kind of talked about how it's recreational, it was social, whereas now it's competitive it's aggressive, it's fast. This shift now meant basketball went from life on the periphery, played by women and girls mainly, to being played nationwide in all areas by men as well. So the 1930s were a really key era for basketball in Scotland.
One persistent problem holding basketball back at this point was that Scots were playing multiple adapted versions of the game depending on their local facilities. There was different court sizes, player numbers, simplified rules. No standardised code existed, making it dysfunctional and off-putting compared to the more well-organised sports like football. How did students playing under the proper rules help bring consistency and legitimacy to the sport in Scotland?
So the students were very key. They brought structure and introduced a consistent format from America that Scots had previously been off-put by because of basketball's lack of structure, lack of leagues, lack of rules, lack of consistency, generally just a lack of almost everything. During the process, it was through public exhibitions at various events and even just at the university matches, which were said to be really well attended under the circumstances. So during this time, they showed the true nature and style of play of basketball to be fast-paced, exhilarating, and the fact that these students also went out into the communities and did coaching sessions and various public engagements meant that they started spreading the correct rules in which, as the sport spread and grew, with the university leagues forming and other games coming to be, it shifted from its prior recreational status into a competitive sport, which in the process helped legitimise it, and in doing so, provided key foundations to grow as now more and more people wanted to play more because it had all the competitive components, had the structure, the organisation that people really craved. So this coupled with the aforementioned growth in the army and so on, in the grand scheme of everything somewhat happened at once in this few years in the early 1930s. But overall, the student population were integral to the process of transforming basketball in Scotland.
The first competitive inter-university match was between the University of Aberdeen and Dundee Medical College in December 1929, catalysing an annual league system across Scotland's universities. Fast forward 10 years to 1939, the University of Edinburgh All-Stars were defeating England's national champions of the time, the resident Americans from London, before 2,000 spectators at Earl's Court. That's remarkable progress in a decade. Can you walk us through how this competitive structure developed and what winning British tournaments meant for Scottish basketball's credibility?
Yeah. So the university competitive system developed through a combination of the current Scottish university sporting system, coupled with the appetite for the Americans' desire for competition. So on the one hand, there was already a system in place within the universities in which other sports were already played nationwide, and yet when the Americans arrived, they wanted to play against other teams and people of a similar level, but the only way to do so was by forming their own league and playing other universities. So it was through this process that basketball was then formally accepted by the student sport organisations, and teams such as St Andrews and Edinburgh all joined this competition and started to play against each other. And then over years, more and more teams started to join, whether that was separate colleges and other teams from formed within the university environment. However, after a few years, many of these top teams, which were filled with some quite high caliber Americans, some of which had potentially even played at the college level in the States, they started to outgrow this small ecosystem and they wanted further competition. So in the process, they heard about these events in England and wanted to challenge themselves against the best, and this is exactly what they did. So in England, the sport was growing a bit quicker than Scotland, and leagues and a national federation had already formed in the mid 1930s and incorporated some rules, the national rules set out by FIBA. So to grow the game, they knew that they had to create bigger competitions in England and Wales on a wider scale to develop and grow basketball more and show it to people to be a sport worth following and playing. So, however, the two Scottish teams who went on to do well in one of these competitions, as you kind of alluded to there, they were very important for Scottish basketball because, as you said, it provided a great deal of credibility because it meant that they were not just the best in a small ecosystem where basketball was played minimally and they didn't have a lot of competition. These guys were the best of the best, and that earned a large degree of respect across the Scottish sport industry because now these players or teams are getting asked by Scottish sport organisations to help in many different ways, such as to come along and conduct public exhibitions and perform at charity events. And This not only gave them status, but in giving them status, it gave credibility and status to basketball as well.
The American students also created entirely new sporting traditions. America versus Scotland matches that had no precedent in Scottish university sport. These displays helped shift public perception from basketball to that of a fast-paced and physically demanding sport. What emerged from your research about how these traditions took hold and how effectively the students' performances actually changed the previously gendered narrative that had played basketball for decades?
So what was key was that these new variations, events, and opportunities were not anything new or unfamiliar. They did not reinvent the wheel per se. Rather, what they did was they took what already existed and they adapted them to merge Scottish sport and culture with basketball to help make basketball fit societal interests and needs. So if what they were doing was very important because this helped Scottish basketball find its space and fit into the system that already existed rather than being on the periphery and without pushing any changes or trying to force American culture onto Scottish people, which was a key part because in the past, when American sports, again, such as baseball, had struggled in the UK was because in the 1890s when they tried to come over here, they tried to push American sport and culture onto the UK population, and the UK culture here was very different and rejected it. So these factors, alongside the actual playing, which completely contradicted all prior notions of basketball, with the Americans playing it in a way which exhibited characteristics of talent, speed, aggression, skill. This was very much now appealed to the new sporting culture of the 1930s, which wanted more fast-paced sports, ones which demand a degree of skill and mastery. Subsequently, the societal changes that were going parallel to the basketball developments were worked very well and aligned very well with this, change that gave Scotland an opportunity to reintroduce basketball per se and to try establish it again.
The university teams became remarkably active in their local communities. They perform at charity events such as the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary fundraisers, most notably the Highland and Agricultural Society's 108th show at Sawton Mains in 1939. These demonstrations in front of huge crowds rivaled lower tier professional football matches and led to increased interest and participation numbers in Edinburgh. How significant were these public performances in taking basketball beyond the university sports landscape and generating genuine grassroots interest across Scotland?
So this was crucial. Had it just been kept in the university ecosystem, then it would have been no different than it was back in the 1890s when it was kept behind the YMCA walls or the Girls' Guides walls, and which meant that it just would have never grown. Whereas taking it to the public and showing it played in the same manner as it was in America and with great skill, although completely different in nature, this drew parallels with Scottish sports such as football, because basketball reflected the same principles of competition and the enjoyment of watching the best of the best, which were why, in many ways, people at the time enjoyed watching sport because of that more professional, that more competitive nature, that higher level of standard that was worth going to see. Furthermore, this increased a great deal of awareness around basketball with knowledge of it following the Royal Highland show because I think across the few days the games were spread, over 100,000 people attended the overall event, and subsequently they went back home with this news of basketball, having experienced it, having saw it, and they were then able to go away and spread it, and a chain effect then occurred of gathering mass like a knowledge and interest in the game, which was really key at the time in terms of transforming attitudes, but again, just increasing general awareness.
In the last podcast, we spoke about the limited newspaper coverage in basketball available in the archives for the first 40 years or so of the sport. Your archive searches reveal a dramatic shift in the 1930s. Basketball coverage in Scotland went from single figures annually before World War One to low three figures by 1939 and placed in much more visible central sports sections. This coincides precisely with the American students' arrival and activities. What's your sense of the relationship between increased student involvement and improved press coverage? Was the media responding to genuine interest, or did the coverage help create it?
So at the time, university sport and its popularity was growing. So too was sport in general among society, and sport tended to often feature at the forefront of newspapers because in many ways, that sport is what helped them sell newspapers. And so while there was more coverage of university sport due to the increases in student involvement, it also came down to more people interest in general, as by the 1930s, more people had time to leisure hours, organisations and the government actively encouraged and supported participation. And so combined with all these factors, this enabled basketball to get more coverage because newspapers were regularly looking for more stories to report on. And with the university teams starting to emerge on a national scale, this only encouraged journalists more because competitive sport and success really appealed to readership. However, the fact that more media attention went to basketball is also a real reflection of the increase in participation and interest across society, because if interest was not there, then the newspapers would not have written about the sport. And this just further reinforces the change in times for basketball, because that shift and that increase in documentation is a reflection now of the fact that a lot more people are paying attention to basketball than in the decades prior.
During this time, students also conducted coaching sessions in their local communities, with some initiatives becoming foundations for permanent basketball clubs, particularly in Edinburgh. Former students also established teams post-graduation, creating lifelong affiliations whilst expanding the university's influence. How did this community outreach and the establishment of post-grad opportunities help sustain basketball beyond the temporary and transient nature of student life?
So by going into the community, this created a new wave of people who wanted to partake in the sport. These university students were purposely recruited because they were seen almost like professional athletes today. The youth look up to them because they were good, because they had this respect that they'd been getting from all the press coverage and the victories against bigger teams. So taking it to the public to teach people in smaller settings subsequently encouraged more and more people to start playing, to set up their own teams, to remain involved. So what they were doing was really no different than what we see professional players doing the same way today by going to visit schools, etc., and running sessions. It was the exact same impact. However, even if we consider it also from within the university system and how this kind of spilled over into society and communities, many of the Scots who played in the university system and on these teams, when they left and they wanted to continue playing, but they returned home to certain communities where no teams existed, many of them sought, when they were in these communities, to create teams, to recruit a group of new people who then taught the game to. And as a result, all these factors stopped basketball from being a bit of a one-hit wonder. And actually, it led to future developments and sustained growth for the sport and sustained interest. So that growth that until now had not really been seen before. And that's why the 1930s is a really key transformative decade.
When we look at the fantastic growth of basketball in this period, unfortunately, there is one problematic aspect to the growth of the sport, and we should discuss this too. Despite the Keep Fit classes offering some opportunities, university basketball clubs were male only, with no conscious effort made to include female students. This isn't unique to basketball and mirrors the broader male dominated Scottish university sporting landscape, where women were left to organise their own affairs. How significant was this exclusion in entrenching gender inequalities, and does it undermine the progress otherwise made during this era?
From what I can glean, basketball never intentionally sought to exclude women in these spaces. Rather, it was the way of the system before them. However, it is disappointing that in this process of basketball's growth, they did happen to entrench these gender inequalities, but equally, basketball did not have the personnel to do much more, as other established organizations at the time did, for example, football and so on. And sadly, while more Americans were coming over, the majority of them still tended to be males due to the gender disparities in society that existed. And so this is a reflection of why basketball grew more so among males than females. Now, that does not make what we're saying right. However, it provides an explanation as to why basketball flipped from being a game played by more women to being a sport played by more men. Although I would not say that this undermines the progress made, purely because it is to be remembered that while great progress was made overall, basketball was still not played on the same scale as football, and there was also no national governing body to support and lead these different avenues of growth, or to pick up where the failures were and to target these other groups who were excluded. It was also largely dependent on those who volunteered their time in which basketball was still played by women in all the same groups as it was since it was a rival. It just unfortunately fell to the backdrop because of these developments by men and the system and society. Despite 40 years on from the 1890s when basketball arrived, a lot of the gender disparities and broader inequalities still remained in place, and the journalists were still very biased on what they were reporting, and men's sport was still at the forefront. The general developments hadn't been made, and sadly, basketball did end up contributing to those outcomes.
To conclude, you argue that developing basketball in Scotland required support from advocates and champions where the sport was popular, and that universities provided optimal infrastructure through facilities, funding, and stability. Yet, you're careful to note basketball remains secondary to football, golf, and rugby, confined largely to pockets in the major cities Aberdeen, Dundee, Edinburgh, and Glasgow. Looking across this transformation for the sport in the 1930s, what strikes you most about what the students achieved within the constraints they faced, and how does this decade of growth set up what happened post World War II?
So what the students achieved was quite remarkable and incredible under this contemporary circumstances. It is to be remembered that all of these people were volunteers who were full-time students, and perhaps some of them even had part-time jobs to help sustain their education or prepare for life after university, because after all of these things, in the university environment, education still always came first before sport. So what these students did was they took on a large degree of work and time commitments in which it would have been really difficult to do much more than they were already doing. So while they deserve enormous credit for this, there was also a range of other people and organisations involved in this broader process as well. So for example, we touched upon the army, in which they are also undoubtedly crucial to introducing the game to thousands and thousands of new people. Furthermore, all of these factors combined ultimately prompted people to start acting and organising the sport, in which many of these actions that we have discussed so far, such as the Royal Highland Show, the exhibitions, many of which were in public parks and spaces, these were all part of an intentional plan to establish basketball in Scotland. It was a range of people and groups all working together, all coming together to formalise basketball and to turn it into the system that we have today. However, it was just very unfortunate that the first association for basketball was established in Edinburgh quite literally days before the announcement of the Second World War. And then that ultimately meant that all of this growth that had happened and been leading up to at this point was halted. While these formal and official steps were impeded, World War II would also then come to play a significant role in what was about to come. If anything, that potentially even expedited some of the outcomes. However, that is a story and a podcast for another day. The development of the new leagues, the teams, and the general interest which came off the back of the 1930s was very much set the formalisation for the sport after World War II, and also established some of the first leagues and the systems and the setups and the rules that we still have today.
Ross, that was amazing. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate you having me on again.